A horrific crime that no one could have predicted. A night that forever changed the lives of 4 young students, and the ripple effects of their deaths have shocked the entire nation. On November 13, 2022, the small town of Moscow, Idaho, was rocked by the brutal murders of Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. Their lives violently stolen as they slept in their off-campus home. It's a case that grabbed national attention, sending shockwaves through the community and beyond. 4 promising young lives, each with so much ahead of them, taken in the dead of night. But the nightmare doesn't end there. The man accused of committing this horrific crime, Bryan Kohberger, has done something unimaginable. He has avoided trial. This isn't just any case. It's one that has left the victims' families, especially Kaylee Goncalves' parents, Steve and Christy, utterly devastated and searching for answers. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. Instead of standing trial for the murders of these 4 students, Kohberger, a former PhD student from Washington State University, has struck a plea deal with the prosecution. This deal not only spares him from facing a jury of his peers, but it also spares him from the death penalty, something Kaylee's family had been fighting for. They were expecting a courtroom showdown, a chance to confront the man who ended their daughter's life. Instead, they've been handed a cruel twist, a deal that protects the killer and leaves their family grappling with a lack of closure. This is the chilling case of Bryan Kohberger, a man who stands accused of one of the most horrific crimes in recent memory. But now, thanks to the plea deal, Kohberger faces no trial, no true justice. He's set to serve life in prison without parole, but is that enough? Was this plea deal a way to avoid the public scrutiny of a trial, or was it a way for the justice system to spare the accused from the punishment he truly deserves? As we uncover the details, we'll dive into the gut-wrenching truth of the plea deal, the anger and heartbreak felt by Kaylee's family, and the questions that will forever haunt this case. What happened that night in the small Idaho home? Why is the justice system sparing Kohberger from facing the consequences of his brutal actions? And most importantly, how is it possible that Kaylee's killer will never have to face the full weight of what he's done? It was a calm, ordinary night, November 13th, 2022. Just another evening in Moscow, Idaho. The University of Idaho campus was settling into its usual quiet, students wrapping up their studies, chatting with friends, and heading to bed. But for Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, this night would be far from ordinary. The off-campus house where these 4 young people had made their home was like so many others. But as night fell, it would become the site of an unimaginable horror. Inside, Kaylee, Madison, Xana, and Ethan were all fast asleep, none of them knowing the terror that was waiting just outside their door. The world seemed calm, almost peaceful. But as the house stood in eerie quiet, Bryan Kohberger, a 28-year-old PhD student from Washington State University, was closing in. He wasn't just another burglar breaking into a home. This was no typical robbery. Kohberger wasn't interested in the possessions that lay within. No, what he was after were lives. 4 lives to be exact. Kohberger methodically broke into the house through the second-floor sliding glass door, slipping in like a shadow. He moved quietly, but his mind was set on a terrifying mission. His path was clear. This wasn't a random attack. It was a calculated, deliberate act of violence. As he crept through the dark house, the noise of his footsteps barely audible, he made his way up to the 3rd floor. There he found Kaylee Goncalves and Madison Mogen, both young women in their early 20s, full of promise and life. What followed was beyond comprehension. Kaylee, who had just celebrated her 21st birthday, was the first target. She never saw it coming. Kohberger didn't hesitate. He attacked swiftly and violently, beating her in the face and head, before mercilessly stabbing her multiple times. Kaylee fought desperately, her body trying to fight back against this monster who had entered her home with a single deadly purpose. But it wasn't enough. Kohberger's cruelty overpowered her will to survive. And then, as if Kaylee's life wasn't enough, the horror continued. Kohberger turned to Madison Mogen, who was with Kaylee, likely shocked and terrified by what was unfolding. She too was stabbed, though the extent of her struggle remains unknown. As with Kaylee, Kohberger didn't spare a second. It was a brutal, unprovoked act of violence that unfolded in mere minutes. But what makes this story even more chilling is that Kohberger didn't stop there. As he moved through the house, he encountered Xana Kernodle, and her boyfriend Ethan Chapin, both 20 years old. The two were asleep in their room on the second floor, when according to court records, Xana happened to walk into the wrong place at the wrong time. Ethan was caught up in this nightmare purely by chance. Kohberger killed them both, Xana with a stab to her neck, and Ethan with multiple stab wounds before fleeing the scene. These weren't random acts. Kohberger was on a mission, and in his twisted mind, he seemed to have no remorse, no hesitation. Then, as if the terror had subsided, one victim, the lone surviving roommate, remained in the house. She had heard nothing, or at least nothing that could prepare her for the horrors she would face when she stepped out of her room. In what can only be described as sheer fate, she survived the night. This brutal, unimaginable act of violence sent shockwaves not only through the small town of Moscow but through the entire nation. It was clear that something deeply disturbing had taken place, but even now we still don't know why. What led Kohberger to pick these students? What drove him to take their lives in such a brutal manner? And perhaps more importantly, what was going through his mind as he walked away from the scene of unimaginable chaos, leaving behind a trail of devastation that would haunt everyone who came across it. As horrific as it is, this is only the beginning of a twisted tale that no one could have predicted. We know the horror of what happened that night, but the true answer to the question of why still eludes us. And now, as we peel back the layers of this disturbing case, one thing becomes clear. This crime is more than just a murder. It's a mystery that the Goncalves family, and all of us, will continue to search for answers to. After nearly 2 years of tireless investigations, unanswered questions, and the relentless pursuit of justice, the day everyone had been waiting for finally seemed within reach. The trial of Brian Kohberger, the man accused of slaying 4 innocent students, was finally set to begin. The world was bracing for a long-awaited courtroom showdown, one that would unravel the mystery behind these brutal murders, one that would hopefully offer Kaylee's family the closure they so desperately needed. For Kaylee's parents, Steve and Christy Goncalves, this trial was not just about securing justice for their daughter. It was about facing the monster who ended her life, demanding answers, and confronting the man who took everything from them. After months of preparation, after endless moments of grief and uncertainty, they were ready for the trial to finally give them a glimpse of the why. Why did Brian Kohberger do this? What kind of twisted mind could carry out such brutality? But then, just days before the trial was set to begin, the unthinkable happened. Brian Kohberger, instead of facing a jury, chose to strike a plea deal with the prosecution, and in doing so, he would plead guilty to all 4 murders. No trial, no courtroom drama, no emotional confrontation, just a simple agreement that would spare Kohberger from the death penalty, a penalty that could have ended his life for the unimaginable crimes he committed. The deal was a shockwave that reverberated through the entire community, but none were more devastated than the Goncalves family. For them, this plea deal was a crushing blow, one that took away their chance for justice in the way they believed was deserved. Kohberger would not face the ultimate consequence for his actions. Instead, the man who killed their daughter, and 3 others, would serve 4 consecutive life sentences in prison. It wasn't what they had fought for, not by a long shot. Imagine, after everything, the late night hours, the court preparations, the endless prayers, and the unwavering hope for the truth to come out. No trial, no chance to face their daughter's killer in court. The Goncalves family had been preparing to face a courtroom full of jurors, hoping for a verdict that could finally put an end to this nightmare. But now, with a plea deal, the story had changed entirely. The world would never know the true reasons behind the killings. No explanation would come directly from Kohberger. No trial would give him a chance to admit his guilt or provide any sense of remorse. Perhaps even more devastating than the fact that Kohberger would escape the death penalty was the realization that the Goncalves family's quest for closure, the very reason they had hoped for a trial, was now shattered. There would be no answers, no moment of justice served in a public courtroom, just the quiet certainty that Kaylee's killer was being allowed to live, serving his time in prison, with no further explanation or remorse. The plea deal was a devastating twist, one that left the Goncalves family in disbelief. The only thing more excruciating than losing their daughter in such a brutal manner was realizing they would never get to hear Kohberger's side of the story. Would he ever explain why he did it? Would the truth ever come out? The plea deal had taken away that chance, and now all they could do was cope with the emotional weight of what had happened, unable to change the course of events. Kaylee Goncalves was more than just a victim. She was a vibrant young woman with a future ahead of her. Her family had every right to demand justice, to demand answers for what Kohberger did to her and to the 3 other students. But in the end, they were left with nothing but a sentence that did not feel like justice. Kohberger's plea deal may have spared him a trial, but for Kaylee's family, it felt like the justice system had failed them once again. Kaylee Goncalves, a mother in unbearable pain, did not hold back in her anguish. In a deeply personal and public post on Facebook, she shared the words that echoed the nightmare her family had been thrust into. Kaylee, just 21 years old, was more than just a daughter. She was a friend, a sister, a vibrant young woman full of promise. She had so much to live for, and yet her life was stolen in a brutal act of violence that no one could ever have imagined. If your 21-year-old daughter was sleeping in her bed, and the man who murdered her beat her in the face, stabbed her to death, what would you want? Kaylee wrote. These words are a reflection of the depths of a mother's grief, a grief that no one can truly understand unless they've walked in those shoes. The sheer horror of what Kaylee experienced in her final moments is something beyond words. Kaylee's post cuts right through the surface of this case, laying bare the heartache and confusion that only a mother's love could explain. The truth Kaylee shared with the world was gut-wrenching. Kaylee didn't just die from a stabbing. No, the brutality was far worse. Kohberger didn't simply take her life with one quick strike. He beat her in the face and head, and then he stabbed her repeatedly. The pain and terror Kaylee must have endured in those final moments, desperately fighting for her life, is incomprehensible. And yet, in the end, she was overpowered by the very man who entered her home, a place that should have been her sanctuary. But what makes this loss even more unbearable for Kaylee and Steve Goncalves is the absence of true justice. Kaylee's killer, the man who snatched her away from them, will never stand trial. The plea deal that allowed Kohberger to plead guilty without ever facing a jury, without ever giving the Goncalves family the answers they so desperately need, has left them with a hollow sense of justice. Kohberger will serve his time in prison, but for Kaylee, Steve, and Kaylee's loved ones, the closure they hoped for is out of reach. Kaylee's words, her plea for justice, capture a mother's heartbreak in a way nothing else could. What would you want? She asks. What would any of us want after such an unimaginable loss? To face the person who caused that pain, to hear their reasons, to hear them explain why they did it, why they took our child, our loved one, and left nothing but an emptiness that will never be filled. The plea deal wasn't just about Kohberger's fate. It was a decision that stripped the Goncalves family of the chance to confront the man who tore their world apart. The emotional toll on the Goncalves family is clear. They are left with no trial, no answers, no opportunity for the closure they deserve. Kaylee's life, her story, is reduced to a mere chapter in a legal proceeding where the killer will never truly face the consequences of his actions. And the agony of that reality is something Kaylee and Steve will carry with them for the rest of their lives. For the first time, Kaylee Goncalves has come forward to share new, horrifying details about the night Kaylee lost her life. Details that no mother should ever have to speak aloud, but that are now etched into her heart with the deepest of pain. What was once feared to be true has now been confirmed. Kaylee fought desperately for her life. This wasn't just an attack. This was a brutal, savage struggle. Brian Kohberger didn't simply break into the house and stab Kaylee as she slept. No, he attacked her first, beating her in the face and head before he ever reached for the weapon that would end her life. Kaylee, full of fight and instinct, did not go down without a battle. She tried to defend herself, her body fighting with everything it had against a man who had already set his cruel plan in motion. The new details paint a picture of a struggle so harrowing, so unimaginable, that it's difficult to fathom what Kaylee endured in those final moments. She wasn't caught unaware. She was violently beaten and brutally stabbed, each blow a reminder of how fiercely she fought, not just for survival, but for the future she was so tragically denied. This wasn't a quick death. It was a prolonged horror, a moment of terror that will forever haunt the hearts of those who loved her. Even more disturbing than the brutality of the crime itself is the fact that Kaylee's killer, the man who inflicted such suffering on her, has been allowed to plea out. In an unimaginable turn of events, Kohberger chose to avoid the trial that so many had hoped would provide answers, a trial that could have exposed the full depth of his cruelty. Instead, he took a deal, a decision that has left Kaylee's family reeling and struggling with the overwhelming sense that justice has been stolen from them. For Christy and Steve Goncalves, the plea deal feels like another layer of injustice in a case that has already turned their world upside down. They wanted to face Kohberger in court, to see him stand trial for every single act of brutality he inflicted on their daughter and her friends. Instead, they are left with unanswered questions and the painful truth that their daughter's killer will never be held fully accountable for the terror he brought into their lives. A deal, a mere plea bargain, has allowed him to escape the full weight of the law, leaving Kaylee's family to bear the emotional and psychological weight of this tragedy alone. The brutality of the crime, the beating, the stabbing, the desperate fight for life, now contrasts sharply with the justice system's failure to hold Kohberger fully accountable. Kaylee's death was horrific, but it's the absence of the trial, the absence of the confrontation, that makes it even harder to bear. For a family who has already lost so much, this deal, this plea, is a cruel reminder that the justice system, in this case, has failed to deliver the closure and accountability they desperately need. At the heart of this case is a question that remains as elusive as it is haunting. Why? Why did Bryan Kohberger target these 4 innocent students? What drove him to commit such an unimaginable act of violence? This is the question that still hangs in the air, unanswered and unsettling. For prosecutors, despite all the evidence gathered, one thing remains painfully clear: the motive for these brutal murders remains a mystery. While investigators have pieced together some details about Kohberger's movements leading up to the murders, there's a critical gap in the evidence that continues to haunt the investigation. They know that Kohberger was in the area around the time of the killings, but what they can't seem to determine is why. Was this a random attack, a crime of opportunity that spiraled into a night of horror, or was there something far deeper, more personal, driving him to commit such an atrocious act? What makes this even more perplexing is the fact that despite the many hours of investigation, there's no solid evidence suggesting that Kohberger had any direct interaction with the victims before the night of the murders. Could it have been a random act of violence? Or was it something more calculated, something personal that we may never understand? These are the burning questions that remain unanswered. As time passes, they only become more unsettling. And this lack of clarity is what makes this case so haunting. Kohberger's plea deal, which led to a swift resolution without a trial, means that we may never get the answers we were all hoping for. The motivation behind these murders, why he chose Kaylee, Madison, Xana, and Ethan, might never be fully revealed. It's a hole in the case, a dark abyss that leaves us all grappling with the questions that no one has the answers to. For Kaylee's family, this is the hardest part of all. The Goncalves family has already endured unimaginable grief, the brutal, senseless loss of their daughter. But without a trial, without hearing from Kohberger himself, they may never understand the why behind her murder. They may never get the closure they need, the clarity that would allow them to make sense of the horror that took their beloved daughter from them. While the legal system has dealt with Kohberger in its own way, Kaylee's family is left to wrestle with the emotional weight of not knowing why this happened. The absence of motive is like a ghost that lingers over the family, haunting them in ways that words cannot describe. They will never hear Kohberger's explanation. They'll never get the chance to confront him in court, to ask him why he did it, or what was running through his mind as he broke into that house and murdered their daughter. This gap in the case is not just a legal issue, it's a personal one. It's the kind of pain that doesn't heal, and it's the kind of mystery that leaves everyone, Kaylee's family, the public, and the investigators, asking the same questions that may never be answered. In the end, the biggest tragedy of all may be the uncertainty that will forever hang over this case. As it stands now, Bryan Kohberger will spend the rest of his life behind bars. 4 consecutive life sentences, no chance of parole, no chance of release. Kohberger's fate is sealed, but for Kaylee's family, the finality of this legal decision is nothing short of devastating. This is not the justice they had envisioned, nor the closure they so desperately need. Steve and Christy Goncalves were prepared to face Kohberger in court, to hear him stand trial, to hear him explain his actions, to confront the man who took their daughter's life. But instead they are left with a plea deal that seems to have wiped away any chance for true justice. The plea deal, which spared Kohberger from the death penalty, is a harsh reality for a family that believes Kaylee's killer deserves far worse. To them, life in prison is not enough. Kaylee's murder was not a random act. It was a calculated, brutal attack, a direct assault on the lives of 4 innocent young people. Yet, as the court handed down its final decision, The sentence felt too easy for someone who had caused such destruction. Kaylee's life, her future, her laughter, all gone in an instant. And now Kohberger faces no further consequence for the terror he caused. Kaylee's family has made it clear. Life in prison without the possibility of parole does not seem like an appropriate sentence for the man who took their daughter's life. They are left with a profound sense of unanswered questions. They will never get the confrontation they had hoped for. They will never see Kohberger in court, never hear him confess to his actions, and most painfully, they will never know the truth behind why their daughter was chosen. But even as this chapter seems to close, questions continue to linger. For the Goncalves family, the legal battle is far from over. As Kohberger begins his life sentence, the family must contend with a deep sense of unfinished business. Will this punishment ever truly be enough for them? Will this really be the end of their quest for justice? Or will there be more twists ahead? Will Kohberger ever speak the full truth of what happened that night? Or will he remain silent, his motives locked away in a place no one will ever reach? As we wrap up, remember, this case is not just about the law. It's about people, lives lost, and the unanswered questions that continue to haunt everyone involved. Let's keep discussing, learning, and honoring the memory of those taken too soon. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more updates on this case and others. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.